I'm Barbara Brownie,
And I'm Nicola Domain.
and we're going to be talking in conversation about what you might wear if you're going on a trip into space. And some of the context of this is the current activities that are going on in commercial space travel. And they're looking at opening up space not just for tourists but also businesses as well. So we'll see all industries really expanding into space. And that includes the fashion industry. So that's what we're going to be focusing on mostly today is clothes and fashion and how they might need to change for space. And SpaceX in particular designed these spacesuits, which I think you'll agree, Nicola, take a little bit of inspiration from
Yeah,
activewear.
there's definitely some really nice details of crossover, which you see frequently in sportswear and things that we pick up on in our design process, which is really nice, the kind of meeting of the two worlds.
So we've got commercial organisations like SpaceX who are designing flight suits and spacesuits.
Functionality is really highly important when it comes to the design of the kind of the SpaceX spacesuit. That's the top priority.
Yeah, and with all spacesuits, it's really more about engineering than it is about the aesthetics. So what we are trying to focus on is not spacesuits, but actually what happens inside the International Space Station or inside spaceships. We don't have the same concerns as we might have in open space. So safety is not so much of a concern. The atmosphere is a bit more like it is inside an aeroplane, where you could wear normal clothes. And they quite often do wear normal clothes, so they wear hoodies and what they call routine wear, which might be off the shelf polo shirts, shorts, cargo pants, and so on.
I guess again, it's very much uniforms that you've seen currently in space, though, isn't it? And we're kind of breaking free of that and taking it away from uniforms and functional leisure wear or utility wear into much more of a thinking about fashion and clothing. So bringing our current perceptions of fashion into a different environment.
Yeah. So we're used to seeing, when we think of clothes that astronauts might wear, we think of uniforms, we think of flight suits. And I think maybe a lot of people are not aware of the fact that do have a certain amount of free clothing choice, astronauts, when they're going to the International Space Station. They can choose from catalogues what shirts and things they want to wear, but they are more restricted than space tourists may one day be. I suspect there will be doors opening for the fashion industry to move away from what we're used to astronauts seeing, who are there to work, and space tourists who are there for leisure purposes, who might be more inclined to want to wear something that is expressive.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points, isn't it, that we start to explore. I think one of the other interesting things looking at this photograph and talking about these gentlemen having bought or chosen these items, they're clearly items designed for in gravity environments. If you look at the hoods, the way they're floating up, that's not something that's been designed for the environment they're now in.
Yeah, so that brings us on to one of the key differences between the environment on Earth and the environment in space, and actually one of the main concerns that we have, and that is weightlessness. Most of the conditions inside a space station are a bit like they are on an aeroplane or on Earth, so the atmosphere is regulated. But the key difference that does exist is weightlessness. They are in a microgravity environment. And of course, that affects how clothes hang around the body. And you can see that here in this image. You can see the sweatshirts, instead of hanging on the body, they kind of balloon around it. On the shoulders there, the shoulders almost seem like they're lifted up and away from the body. And as Nicola said, the hood is kind of floating upwards. And so these garments that were really designed to be draped on the body, to hang against the body, are not. Instead, they're ballooning outwards, kind of billowing out, and they've left air between the clothes and the body. And we think a lot about weight. Obviously, as fashion designers designing on Earth, the weight of fabric very much dictates how a garment drapes on the body. So weight and drape are very much associated with each other, and we take for granted that we design around drape. We choose fabric's weight because it drapes in a particular way.
Yes, I mean, again, this image shows that knitted rib collar would, in our environment, just would not lift. You put it there because it's a heavier piece of fabrication which won't pull up, which is now, with the weightlessness, doesn't conform to the things you expect it to do at all.
So if you start to consider what might happen to fashion items that are perhaps a little bit more loose fitting in this weightless environment, we start to see all sorts of new interesting shapes that you might not get on such a form-fitting garment as a polo shirt or a hoodie. And actually you start to create whole new silhouettes that are very, very different to the silhouette of the body because of the extent to which the clothes billow out from the contours of the body.
What is happening here is fabric weights, which are very different, are behaving similarly. It's very beautiful, isn't it? There's something really poetic about the way that the garments lift and contort and kind of they're fluid.
It's quite ethereal, yeah, and quite like clothes underwater. So there's an opportunity to use space to really embrace that kind of a feeling of etherealness and to create something quite beautiful and fluid and natural. And we associate space and engineering and with quite stiff geometric forms and sharp angles and sharp edges. But actually, weightlessness, if you combine it with fluid, soft fabrics, creates an opportunity for these really nice soft forms. One of the other key things that happens as a result of weightlessness is that there is no up and there's no down, there's no top and there's no bottom. So in the International Space Station, there's no ceiling and there's no floor. And so you might encounter another person and another dressed body at any angle.
Which I guess is one of the other key considerations, isn't it? You're viewable from all angles.
Yeah, so we need to start thinking about what clothes look like from above and below and from all the other angles in between. And there's actually a bigger cultural shift that's worth talking about here. I've included this image, which is a satellite image of Earth, to remind us that we are now increasingly used to seeing aerial views of things as a result of space travel. So drones, but also satellite images, have exposed us to these aerial views that we never would have seen in the past. And in the past, we were so used to looking at everything vertically or, in upright position from the side or from the front or from the back. And aerial views are becoming much more common, and we're starting to see these angles and views that we didn't used to see in the past. And space travel means that we also need to start thinking about that for clothes as well. In these kind of images, you see much more of the shoulder seams and the things. You don't really think about shoulder seams when you're designing clothes.
I think as well, like, you think of what flatters a body and what doesn't, and you can clearly see in these garments that the proportions of the body are no longer applicable, that things that would have been flattering in a gravity environment change people's proportions in a way that they potentially don't want to be changed in.
Absolutely. So we think about silhouette and flattering the silhouette. We think about that ratio of bust to waist to hip, and you don't see those parts of the human body when they are at these angles. You don't see the same silhouette, and so the notion of what flatters or how to flatter the body has got to be completely rethought. As an extension of that, you also don't see the upright body. You don't see the body outstretched, because if you are weightless, you can't stand upright on the floor. And so you never see an elongated or erect body. You see them from different angles, but also in different postures. And they're postures that we're not used to seeing on Earth. They're a bit more like this, semi-seated position. And so other parts of the body are prominent that you don't pay much attention to on Earth, like the knees, for example, and the shins are quite often very, very visible when you encounter a body in the weightless environment.
I guess in the back as well, isn't it?
If you're in a seated position, then you need more room on the back. You need more length in the back of the shirt. And that's something that is taken into account already with some flight suits. So this, for example, is a flight suit that's on display in the Moscow Cosmonaut Museum, and you can see that the back of the upper body is not sewn into the lower body. Instead, it's tucked in, so there is room for that backside to lengthen as the body curves round and into that neutral posture.
It's a clever design solution, but I think as it comes to fashion and aesthetics, it kind of lacks that aesthetic, which is hopefully what we're hoping to try and think about.
Yeah, so some of the space industry's solutions to these things do work, but they're perhaps not as aesthetically pleasing or as smooth or as interesting as they could be if we're looking at these problems from a fashion perspective. So there are some designers who have started to think about these issues that arise from weightlessness, and not all of them have explicitly engaged with space, but have engaged with some of the things that we've talked about. So we've talked about orientation, and we've talked about how drape and weight don't function in the same way in space, and those are all things that some fashion designers have started to engage with. So we can learn from those fashion designers when we are beginning to design spacewear, and Julian Roberts is an example of that.
Yeah, he's a very, very interesting designer, but probably most prominently a pattern cutter. He has kind of taken a technique which disregards the orientation of the body and creates tunnels and channels, which you can kind of see here if you look at the circles that are cut in the fabric. He uses the circles in the fabric, joins them together, and it means that orientation is lost. It becomes drapes and folds. There's tunnels, almost like black holes, through the centres of garments. If you see the pattern here, on the right image, you can see the top of a bodice, the two straps, they join together. Now that, in pattern cutting terms, is not how you would normally lay patterns, and just by diverting the normal kind of orientation, it creates all these beautiful new directions and pieces of fabric that you'd never see. It's got several different techniques, but all of them kind of play on the idea of orientation.
So he approaches a garment not from the front view or the silhouette view, but maybe from above, or at least he approaches pattern cutting from above and imagines the body being fed through the middle of a garment, not the garment being placed on the front of the back and joined on the sides. And so when you look at his patterns, you can't obviously see where the front and the back are, because there isn't a top and a bottom. The orientation is very much kind of confused and mixed up, and upright is not the same in one part of the pattern as it is in another part of the pattern.
What I like about it as well is that it creates wormholes. So you see the holes that are appearing when they're joined, they create these kind of wormholes, which reflects kind of the notions of space and time, I guess.
Yeah, and a wormhole is about, what a wormhole does is it compresses space and time, and in a similar way, these holes are joined together in a way that compresses the rest of the garment, so that different bits of fabric are joined together in spaces where they wouldn't normally be joined together. And interestingly, this is an example of what some of his work might look like when weightless. So there are also other fashion designers who are explicitly being informed by space, and not necessarily designing for space travel, but being informed by the aesthetics of it, and being informed by knowing the information that we've shared about how weightlessness affects fashion design.
It might be the place where kind of technical fashion meets high fashion. If you look at the garments, you can see there's a lot of technical detail, which is a nod to the functionality.
Yeah, although we have been talking about fashion as something that would replace the very technical and functional clothes that already exist in space, we don't necessarily want to completely throw all that technicality out the window. It will be about finding a compromise between the aesthetics and embracing what happens as a result of weightlessness, and also the functionality, which is, of course, required to some extent in that environment and in any environment.
I think this image is lovely. The girl on the left with the slit in her sleeve obviously is a beautiful detail to be imagined without gravity. The way that would billow and slash open as it is doing there.
And is a good example of something that would function differently in two different states. So for those times when you need your spacewear to be much more functional, that zip could be done up and you then get a form-fitting flight suit. But for the times when you want to be a bit more expressive and float around and maybe take selfies of yourself looking weightless, you unzip the zip and then your clothes billow out, have the visible effects of weightlessness. And Nicola, you've also done your own design that's been very much inspired by the weightless environment.
Yeah, I guess so. Whilst we've been doing our ongoing research, part of what I've been doing has been designing in the background, responding to things that we find out, knowledge that we gain along the way. These are some of the first images from when I started sketching and doing some designs, taking into consideration the weightless environment. And this is, I guess, my inspiration. These are visualizations of wormholes and black holes. And from a very unscientific point of view, I find them very fascinating with the grid-like structures and how the grids kind of capture information. As any creative has to approach something, I needed to look outside of the obvious space-inspired thing and into the world of art. So here I've got two pieces of art that led me from the wormhole grids into kind of artworks. And the piece on the right is a Richard Deacon piece, which again, for me as a creative, symbolises the idea of freedom of movement, different planes and surfaces that might be available in a gravity-free environment. You can see the Deacon piece against a body. You can see floating fabric, which was taken from a space video, which I then went and traced over. The idea of everything kind of swirling and contorting. And from there, I did the first illustration, which is on your right, the black print idea, which was the kind of contortion of my idea of space and time. And I guess this led us on to our print idea. This print is the first kind of variation of the idea of capturing space and time, movement, gravity. And this is just a quick mock-up of how that might be seen on a garment, which has a neck piece, which contained the print, which was supposed to kind of capture how a fabric would respond in a zero gravity environment.
And using that repeat pattern on it, the pattern that's derived from your studies of the wormhole, actually we realised would be quite useful, because if you've got a repeat pattern, you can start to use that to study the effects of weightlessness on drape. So we started to realise that we could use that kind of pattern to actually quantify the effects of weightlessness on drape as much as we could use it for fashion purposes.
Yeah, that was really exciting, wasn't it, that moment that we realised that.
So then that led us on to realising that we needed a registration pattern that would be something that we could use to print on fabric and then design spacewear out of it, and then study it to see how the grid has been deformed, how the pattern has been deformed, so that we can then start to quantify the effects of weightlessness and use that data to more effectively study the effects of weightlessness and understand how it works, feed it into future designs of spaceware.
So this is our second kind of round of designing. We started this working in a really conventional way, so by mocking up some sketches of shapes that we knew would work well in a weightless environment. So basing things on circular shapes, things with lots of fabric so that we knew that they would drape. But I think the reason I've included this slide is because it's drawn in a conventional way. It's drawn using a conventional mannequin template in the upright position, and it only gives you part of the information that you need to start to actually design things for this kind of environment. So for me as a designer, it's my go-to tool to use.
It's interesting you say tool there. You talk about the image of the upright body as a tool, and that's very true. It is one of those fundamental, very important basic tools in every designer's toolkit, is the figure of the upright body. And we have to start discarding those tools, those things that we take for granted as designers. We actually need to turn around and say, well, no, they're no longer relevant, they're no longer useful in this weightless environment.
Yeah, for sure. And because it doesn't give you what you need. These images we created by 3D scanning like a mannequin and then rotated them. So this is a 3D shape, but this has been the shape that I'm having to use now as a mannequin to design on.
So it's completely changed even your initial stages of your design process. You are having to approach different shapes or create different shapes on the page right from the beginning of the design process.
And it's a really challenging thing to do as a designer. You're used to capturing things in one way, seeing things in one way, being used to conventions such as drape and gravity, orientation. Once those things are gone, things become very different, and it's a really exciting challenge. So talking about the upright image and then putting it next to the neutral posture image. So it's the same design that I'd sketched out initially, but obviously it's pointless designing for a weightless environment in an upright position. So I started by getting the neutral position and drawing on the shape, how it would be. This design here is the same jacket that initially imagined in a 2D upright environment, using the mannequin, the 3D visualization of the neutral position. So I picked one of the less challenging poses to kind of illustrate from. And this design I thought was particularly nice because we use the idea of the circle, which you can see on the skirt of the jacket, which kind of flies up in a weightless environment, like a ring of a planet almost, I guess. I guess the other interesting design details on this, in regards to the neutral position, the gather on the back.
So the back becomes another canvas for us, something that we haven't really thought about much or don't often think about when we're designing earthwear.
I think it's a lovely opportunity, really. A large curved surface for a designer is something really fun to play with.
Absolutely, and we've got a lot of these new curved surfaces, including the knees, for example, and the seats, that we don't really tend to notice so much when we encounter another person when we're walking towards them on Earth.
I think something else about this design that's up on the screen at the moment, if you know, it can see on one side there's a little like gathered section with a pulley system up the side of it. Obviously, because the skirt is very large and flies out, this might not always be something you're wanting to have a skirt orbiting you almost. So I think a lot of the designs that people will have to create will have to have a multifunctional kind of side to them. So this is the idea of you being able to pull it up.
And that's particularly important in the early days of space tourism, where a lot of space tourists are going to be doing very short-term trips into space. So Virgin Galactic, for example, is anticipating really short suborbital flights in which people might only encounter, say, or might only experience about 10 minutes of weightlessness. So they're going to be wearing this garment more in an Earth gravity situation than they are in the weightless environment. And so it's quite helpful to have a garment that can be transformed in that way. And you can wear it in one way when you're still on the ground, and then in another way when you really want to take advantage of the weightlessness, but you're only there for a short period.
So I guess this is kind of one of the final realizations of this design as it stands, but with the grid on it, which will prove quite interesting as we expecting the skirt part of the garment to have a lot of movement, which will be captured by the grid. But we also expect that there'll be some movement on other parts of the garment, like Barbara noted previously, like around the shoulders, around the arms, which again we'll be able to note and register with the grid system.
Yeah, so what the grid system allows us to do is to compare how these garments drape on Earth to how they don't drape or how they billow in the weightless environment by tracking the movement of those registration points.
We did underwater experiments to see how circular shapes would react without gravity, which are these images here. And this has given us a great deal of information on kind of how things potentially might move.
Yeah, the underwater environment is very useful if you're trying to simulate the effects of weightlessness, although it's not a perfect simulation because there is some drag in it.
You talked about tools earlier, but this as a designer is an informative tool on how do I illustrate something, how do I design something, like how does fabric fall? Without knowing it, you can't even begin your sketch.
And that's one of the problems that we face, is we are having to design for an environment that we can't experience. We can only simulate it imperfectly. We can simulate it with imperfect computer software that doesn't quite understand different kinds of fabrics. We can simulate it a little bit underwater, but then we've got drag. We can simulate it for a split second if we jump up and down on a trampoline. And all of those things, to a degree, begin to show us what happens in the weightless environment. But ultimately, we are not up there in space. And so we've still got quite a lot to learn. And so the first phases of this really need to be data collection. We need to fully understand how weightlessness affects drape before we can really take next steps. There's potential for the fashion industry to engage a lot more. So what we've been doing is really just very early steps towards engaging with that weightless environment.
Yeah, it's a really exciting opportunity as a designer to do something ahead of what most people are doing, but also to challenge yourself against the conventions of design, like the things we discussed, like orientation, drape, gravity. They're all really exciting and totally challenging to approach.
Yeah, we take so much for granted. We take orientation for granted, and we take drapery and weight for granted in fashion design and silhouette and all of those things. We just have to throw out the window and start again from scratch and reconsider the body and the relationship between clothes and the body in new ways.